Hello and welcome to Swift Creek Customs. Today I'm making a couple of floating shelves that are going to sit behind our television. And to do that, I ordered a couple of these brackets. They're floating shelf brackets off of Amazon. I really like these brackets for a couple of reasons. One is that you can see that there's a whole bunch of small little holes that will help for alignment because not everyone has studs in the same spots on their walls. And then this way it allows you to kind of move this back and forth along the wall so that you can find the studs and still get the shelf in the place that you want it. And there are lots of different attachment points, so you can really double up or triple up the screws if you really feel like you need to. Though I think that if you're using sufficiently decent screws and you're getting them sunk into the studs, that you shouldn't need that. These are nice, very durable shelf supports. They do require a drilling jig that the company sent me one of these each time I've ordered these. And then I did order, and I'll put these links in the video description, also a drill bit that I will show you how to use. I've found that just doing it by hand is the best, but I've seen other people use power drills for this as well. But if you don't have a power drill, or if you want to just, do it my way, that's fine too. And then the wood we're using is actually this large piece of fir that I brought back from the family farm that is in Montana. This fir was originally purposed as a corral for the cattle, and my dad's retired now and we don't have any cattle on the farm, so I grabbed up a bunch of this wood when I was up in Montana last time. And so I've been making a bunch of projects with it. I've already made three floating shelves for my sister, and now it's time to make a couple for myself. And then I've made a TV console cabinet, and I think I've still got enough wood that I will be able to make a whiskey cabinet, which will be another project in the future. So join me for this fun little adventure. It shouldn't take me too long. I should be able to get most of the work done this morning, or in about 2 to 3 hours. And then it'll just be a lot of just time in between for doing the finishing work. But it's a very simple project. It does require some more advanced tools if you have them. You could choose a different type of wood that's already surfaced and squared, and then that would kind of save you some time and effort. But you do want a sufficiently thick piece of wood. This piece of metal on the back here is about 1.25 inches, so you want at least 1.5 inches thick wood so that you can hide this behind and inside the actual shelf itself. So let's go ahead and get started. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Please subscribe to our channel. Really appreciate your support. Okay, so since the board was pretty much a raw board from the farm, I'm going to need to cut it down to size just to even start working with it through some of the machines. So the first thing I do is I set up my crosscut sled and try and get it down to not the final dimensions, but small enough that I can start running it through the jointer and the planer, and then I'll cut it down to the final dimensions later after I've got it surfaced, got everything squared up and looking good. So you can see I'm measuring it. It's not real precise. I just have to get it fairly close. And this is a pretty thick board. I think when I started it was just over 2.5 inches, which when you combine that with the thickness of the sled, it's kind of tricky to cut all the way through. So I ended up having to flip it over after I made the initial cut because my blade, if I raised it too high, it would start raising up the sled. So this is pretty much the max size for my sled and table saw. Alright, got the first one cut to rough size. Gonna get the second one on here. And I like to leave a couple inches extra on each end for the planing, so that if I get any snipe or anything that would catch at the very beginning or very end of the board, I can cut it off later after I do the final dimensioning. Alright, now that I've got them cut down to size, the next thing I need to do is joint one edge so that it's nice and clean to be able to run against the fence of the table saw. So I just do a couple of passes on the joiner. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I will be redoing this again as well later after I get it closer to final dimension. Alright, So I put on my ripping blade on my table saw. It's a 40-tooth Freud blade. I really like having this for, especially for thicker stock. The distance between the teeth helps clear out the material so that you don't get a lot of binding on the saw as you're trying to feed through, especially thick boards. Raise it up to the correct height. I also have a dust collector that I run so that it picks up as much of the sawdust as possible as this cut's happening. You'll hear it in the background at some other points, I'm sure. Alright, so this is not getting them to final width, this is just getting them to an approximate width so that I can start running them through the planer. And here I'm not going to show every single pass on the planer, but it takes a while to get through and get these each of these boards nice and smooth. So with the process of movie magic, now that I've got a nice smooth surface on the face of the board, I'm going to run it through the jointer so that I can get a nice clean 90-degree edge on the edge of the board, and then I'll use that edge against the fence of the table saw, and I can rip this down to the final width of about 8 inches. Here I am setting up the cut on the table saw, again using the ripping blade. And you can see I'm not taking a whole lot of material off, just enough to get it down to that final dimension on both boards. Now that I've established the final width of the board, I'm going to set up a cut for a reference edge so that I can start working on cutting the final length of each board. It's important to have a nice 90-degree cut for each of these edges as well. And I set this up so that the reference edge was a very small cut so that I can exclude this knot that otherwise would kind of ruin the corner of the shelf. So sometimes knots add character. This one I felt was going to be too hard to work around.
Okay, so I've got the boards to what is going to be their final dimension. I've got them 32 inches long by about 8 inches wide, and they're a little over 2¼ inches thick. That will provide plenty of wood for me to be able to mount this and recess it without having too close of an edge where it might split or break off. Not that I'm too worried about that. The shelves aren't going to be used a lot, like taking on and off the wall. Pretty much once I get them on the wall, they're going to be set. So from this point forward, I need to cut the holes for these pegs. They will be going in quite a ways. They're about 6 inches long, and so I'm going to need to bore that hole in. I need to make sure that I'm getting them as centered as possible on the actual shelf, so that when I put the shelf on the wall, which there's lots of flexibility here with both the bracket and being able to kind of move the shelf around a little bit, but I do want to try my best to get these on the wall in a particular way. You'll see when I go to film the part inside where I'm mounting them. But for now, I am just going to try and get them centered, which means I'm going to have to do some measuring, do some marking, and then from there, it's going to be pretty easy. I'll just recess a pocket in the back for the shelf to go over the bracket, and then I'll round over the sides, sand it down, and it's pretty much ready from finish from that point forward. So let's get started on the next part of this process.
All right, so the first thing I do is find the exact center of the board, and then from there I can work outward, measuring off the actual shelf support to make sure that I'm putting these in the exact correct location. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-drill for each of the poles on the shelf support, and then I can use those as kind of a guide for the drill bit, and then I use the jig that was sent with the shelf supports to I screw it down and make sure it's as centered as I can get it. And then it's just a matter of using a 1/2-inch ratchet that I have that fits really well over the end of the bit, and then it's just a bit of Armstrong work, making sure you can't go the entire way all at once. You have to back it out to clear out the shavings, but it's not a very difficult process. It takes a little bit of time, but I really feel that doing it by hand is the best way to do it, because that way I can make sure
that those holes are going in nice and straight, and that I'm not meeting any resistance, or that there's not any problems using that particular bit. And it doesn't take too long. I've sped up this video, but I got all these holes drilled in a time of about 10 minutes. Once I got all the holes drilled, it's time to put up the recess in the back. So I'm using these setup blocks that I got off Amazon. I'll put a link down in the description below. If you haven't used setup blocks before, they are a great way to ensure that you're getting the exact dimensions that you need. So I set the depth of the cut on the fluted router bit, and then I'm setting up, it takes a little bit to figure out the exact width for the gap between the edge of the bracket and the edge of the board. But with a little bit of combining different setup blocks, I finally get there. I wanted to have a little bit of room, but I wanted it to be nice and snug. So then I used that same dimension to set the distance between the router bit and the fence on the router table. Now what I'm doing here is I'm marking or setting the marks on the fence so that I know when to start and to stop my cut, so that I'm not cutting too much away from each edge, and I'll clean that up later with a hand router. So there you see I tilt into the blade, cut until I see that reference line that I put on the fence. And I had to do this on both sides of the board. Now here's where I'm going to use the palm router. You can see there's a little bit of material left on each end. I set the depth of the bit, and then I trimmed those lines that I already put on the board. With that trimming done, I can now test fit the actual shelf support to make sure it seats nicely, which it does. I'm very happy with that. My big fat sausage fingers can't quite get in to pull it out, so I had to go get some pliers to pull it out. Now, I didn't want just a sharp edge on each of these boards, so I'm using a chamfer bit on the palm router. I'm just very carefully going around and setting up that nice edge, but I did get some, since I was doing this on the end grain, I was getting some nasty splintering going on. So the next pass, I decided to wrap it with some blue painter's tape that should hopefully reduce some of that splintering and kind of hold the board together a little bit more on that end grain. But these boards are old and very dry, so sometimes that you do what you can, but it can't completely be prevented. Just go nice and slow and get a nice edge on there. Now that I've got the two ends done, I'll rotate it, and then I'll do the same process on the long edges. Going nice and slow in the correct direction of the spin of the router bit, so it's pulling it into the board. Now I like to lay down this shelf liner so that when I'm sanding, the board doesn't move, and it also helps protect the board so that if I put the sanded surface down, it's not going to be creating a bunch of scratches from my workbench. I slowly work up through all the grits. You'll see that I've sped this up because you don't need to see me sanding. I started with 120 grit. I sanded up to 150 grit. I didn't go beyond that because I like the feel of the texture where I left it at 150 grit. And after it's finished, it still has a nice smooth finish, but I'm finishing it with a satin finish, so it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, so that you see that nice shiny glossy finish on the actual shelf itself. This is the same process I used for the TV stand that is going to be in the same room, so it should match pretty nicely once I've got all the finishing done. Once I've finished sanding with the power sander, I then go through and do a quick hand sand with the grain of the wood, just so that it kind of knocks down any swirl marks or anything like that that may have been left. And then I work on staining the shelves. This is a stain that I had around. It's a varathane walnut stain. I used it on the TV stand that was made for the same room, and so to match the shelves, I'm just using the same stain. This stain gives the wood a nice dark rich color that when combined with the satin finish I find to be actually very beautiful. And the beauty of movie magic is that these shelves practically stain themselves. Once the stain has had a chance to dry for a couple of hours, I actually did this the next day. I get a nice clean cloth and I'm using the General Finishes satin that I picked up at Woodcraft, not sponsored. And you want to make sure you mix it up thoroughly so that you're distributing all the different particles throughout the solution. And then I just use a clean rag to wipe this on. I think I did 3 coats with a light sanding in between. I'm not going to show all that in the video, but you'll get the idea. I really like this satin finish. It applies nicely whether you're wiping it on or using a brush. And you know, the only thing that you have to kind of keep an eye on is if you're putting it on thick, you want to go back over the wood periodically and wipe up any runs or drips that you get, because otherwise you'll have to be doing a lot more refinishing down the road. So as you can see, this finish brings out the wood, the sheen of it just enough. It really gives it some depth and really makes it look nice. And since this will match the TV stand that we already have, it'll just kind of give that corner of the room a nice completed look. And moving on to installation, I've got my assistant here to help me move some stuff out of the way. You'll see the TV stand that I made previously using the same stain and finish. And a trick that I learned somewhere else, I think from my dad actually, is to use some blue painter's tape to kind of set up the size of the shelves so that we can discuss where we're going to be putting other elements that we're going to be putting around this same location. I go through and I make sure that everything looks good, make sure it's all level, and now it's time to start finding all the studs. The right-hand shelf caused a bit of problem because there was something in the wall. We're not really sure what. I don't think it was electrical, but something was setting off the stud finder a lot, and so I was just being very careful and extra cautious to make sure that we weren't drilling into anything like a pipe or a electrical wire behind where the shelf was going to set. So I get the first shelf bracket in place. I think I was using some 3-inch exterior grade screws that go directly into the studs. I left the tape on behind the shelf bracket. That'll be a nice surprise for when we go to take this off. A little bit of fiddling on the shelf bracket, but you can see how having all those extra slots in the bracket to find the studs and, you know, correctly hang these is really helpful. There, remember to take the tape off this time. Get it completely set on the wall and the shelves are in. Now it's just a matter of putting up the other decor items that we've got. As you can tell, we're very finicky about making sure things are centered. Be careful who you give your hammer to. And if you know me at all, you know that I'm a big fan of Legos. And so these are 2 of my Lego space kits. One's the International Space Station, the other one is the Apollo lander. So I get those up on the shelf because that's high priority. One of these shelves is mine, the other one is Ellie's. And we get the TV put back in place. Some final posing, ta-da! And Rustic meets Nerd. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we appreciate your support. Later, taters.